I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. The fight for justice over Ukrainian International Airlines flight PS 752 continues as experts say more needs to be done. On January 8th, 2020, 2 missiles struck the plane and all 176 people on board were killed. This included 85 Canadian citizens and permanent residents. It also included citizens from Sweden, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine. Iran has blamed the tragedy on human error. However, a recent court decision in Ontario ruled the strike intentional and an act of terrorism. The judge ruled that the families of 6 victims be awarded over $100 million in damages. The Canadian government issued a statement in January and said it would be holding Iran accountable. But in a recent article in the Hill Times, one expert says Canada must do more. And with us to talk more on this is Mr. Zvi Khan, a research fellow focusing on Iran at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, we mentioned an Ontario judge ruled that the downing of Flight PS 752 was intentional and an act of terrorism. So take us back to what led to this ruling in the first place.
Well, ever since the downing of Flight PS 752, Iran has engaged in a campaign of concealment and obfuscation regarding its role in the downing of the plane. It claimed that it was downed by human error, but in the 2 years since then, a lot of compelling indicators have indicated that Iran may have played a greater deliberate role than it originally led on. For example, Iran has been harassing the families of members of PS 752, the families of the victims of PS 752. They have concealed, destroyed evidence. They've prevented international inspectors from accessing the crash site. They've also, if you look at the shoot down themselves, it shows that Iran was positioning the air defense missile system right near the shoot down, even though this was right near Tehran's international airport. So why was Iran doing that? Also, when you look at the technical capabilities of the staff who monitor and who engaged the flight, it shows that they were quite actually experts in identifying planes like that. So it's very unlikely that they would be able to mistake a cruise missile for an airplane. And I think based on these indicators and many others, there's ample reason to suspect Iran's official story.
All right, some very interesting information there. Now, this Ontario judge is demanding the families of 6 victims be awarded millions of dollars in damages. What do we know so far about the governments of the other 3 countries and what they've called for Iran to do?
Well, they too have called for Iranian accountability. They've called for truth. They've called on Iran to come clean. But for the most part, what we've seen from all these countries, including Canada, is just really a lot of rhetoric. They're calling on Iran to do this. They're calling on Iran to do that. But they haven't been putting any coercive pressure, any consequences on Iran for its behavior. And I think until they do that, it's unlikely that we're going to see any real change of behavior by Iran. Now, in a recent statement, the countries did indicate that they would look to further action pursuant to international law. They've given up on negotiations. But it's unclear yet what they would actually do. So I think in the coming weeks and months, Canada and its allies are going to have to fundamentally reassess their position and to make a real determination of really what Iran has done and what the consequences of that should be.
All right, sir, just about a minute and a half left here. But going back to an article to the Hill Times where you and the Association of Families of Flight PS 752, you're suggesting that Canada can do more in this situation. So what steps can Canada take here?
I think there are a range of steps Canada can take. It can refer Iran to the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN body tasked with devising global standards for aviation. It can refer there, which in turn can go to the International Court of Justice. The RCMP could conduct independent investigation of the shooting. To date, it inexplicably has not done so. Instead, it's been assisting a Ukrainian investigation. On top of that, Canada should impose global Magnitsky sanctions on the perpetrators of the shoot down, and it should also designate, I think, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, is the entity that oversaw the shoot down of Flight PS 752, and there should be real consequences of that that Canada should impose.
A quick 30 seconds left here, Mr. Khan, but what's at risk here if Canada does not take these steps and hold Iran accountable?
Well, first and foremost, this is about justice. This is about truth. What happened with the downing of Flight PS752? I think Canada has an responsibility to get down to the bottom of what happened and to give some closure, I think, to the families of the victims. 176 people were killed, and yet they don't have closure. They don't know what happened, and Iran has not come clean. I think this also sends a really terrible, if Canada fails to act, I think it sends a really terrible message about what Iran can get away with.
As of early this afternoon, there was limited traffic crossing the Ambassador Bridge into Detroit, Michigan from Windsor, Ontario. Yesterday, a demonstration against COVID-19 measures blocked travel in both directions. The bridge remains closed to traffic heading into Canada, and the company that owns it wants officials to make prompt action to resolve the situation quickly. As of this morning, traffic was flowing slowly through the Coutts border crossing in southern Alberta. With us now to talk about the disruption at the Ambassador Bridge and what it means for the economy is Mr. Rakesh Naidu, President and CEO of the Windsor-Essex Regional Chamber of Commerce. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima. Thanks for having me here.
So what are the most recent updates on the situation at the Windsor-Detroit border right now?
Yeah, well, we're still experiencing disruption. Sometime back, one lane was open for traffic going towards US. But more recently, CBS has announced that they're temporarily closing down the bridge, which means there is no traffic flowing this way, though the tunnel is open, and I believe traffic is being diverted to the Sarnia border as of now.
And what sort of impact will this have on your members in particular, sir?
Well, tremendous. This is a very important border crossing for Windsor-Essex region, but I would say for Ontario and for Canada, every day there is almost 300 million plus worth of goods that crosses that particular bridge. The goods that are brought in are goods which are required for many different sectors. There is, manufacturing parts, components that go into several automotive plants that several tens of thousands are employed in. There is perishable goods that cross the border. There is goods that a lot of small businesses rely on. So it's a very important border crossing, and any disruption in the border crossing can have a significant impact, especially for a lot of businesses that have just-in-time manufacturing, which requires them, or which basically what they do is they run with very low inventory, and when you have such a low inventory, any disruption can be very significant.
And as you're saying, this is one of the most busiest border crossings in North America. So what kind of disruption would this have on citizens and consumers in Windsor and even across Canada if this continues?
Well, it'll come back and bite all of us. As I mentioned, that goods, many different kind of goods cross the border, whether it is automotive components, whether it's perishable goods, food items, groceries, you name it. There's so much that crosses the border on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, that if there's a disruption, at some point of time, it's going to, hit us. There will be empty shelves potentially at the grocery stores. There'll be cost increases. We're experiencing a 30-year high inflation as it is. Part of it is because of supply chain disruption. And what this is doing is really increasing the supply chain disruption, and that will add to the cost. So eventually, all of us will be paying for it, no matter which side we are on, all of us will be impacted by it.
Wow, sounds like quite a significant impact, sir. So what kind of steps are you calling for from the federal and provincial governments to tackle this?
Well, first of all, I think a border crossing is so important, so vital for the economy of both countries. I think it needs to be free. For a free and fair trade to happen, the barriers should be completely removed. The trade should flow completely unhindered. So we are calling for a very timely, immediate action so that the border can be opened up and the goods can flow freely. We also urging everyone, both sides, to sit down, have a conversation, and find a resolution. And we would like that to happen at the earliest. This blockage is hurting us. It's a crisis situation. Even if an hour or 2 hours goes by when the border is closed, it starts impacting businesses, especially in the Windsor-Essex region and those regions that have similar supply chain and makeup of industry. And this has been going on for much longer. So we're really expecting both sides to come up sit down and come up with a resolution at the earliest.
And have you heard back from any of these authorities from both the U.S. or Canada in terms of your calls to action?
Well, what I can share is that there's growing concern on both sides. We are in constant touch with several businesses on both the Canadian side and the U.S. side. As of just about 15 or 20 minutes back, there is at least 70 plus organizations within Canada and US that have voiced or they've expressed their dissatisfaction at the situation and that are urging immediate steps. These are large organizations and associations that represent several thousands of businesses in Canada and US.
A new survey suggests Canadians are less trusting of governments and politicians as the pandemic drags on. The latest edition of the Proof Strategies Trust Index also shows almost half of the more than 1,500 people polled last month are still feeling anxious or stressed out about the virus and the government's handling of the Omicron variant. Proof CEO Bruce McLellan says a pattern of contradictory decisions or reversing course on advice or health measures has shaken confidence. Only 1 in 5 people surveyed say they trust governments or politicians. This is compared with 2 in 5 who said they had trust in May 2020. Well, with us now to unpack the survey is Mr. Bruce McLellan, the president and CEO of Proof Strategies. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hello, Nima. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what would you say are the main findings of this recent survey, sir?
Well, it's a bit like it's the best of times and the worst of times for trust in Canada. The pandemic is definitely taking a toll. We know that people, when they're stressed or anxious, are less likely to be trusting. And now, as you say, with almost half of Canadians reporting that they're still feeling anxiety and stress due to the pandemic, we're seeing that those people have lower trust scores than the people who tell us that they did feel stressed but are feeling more positive now about their life. So the people who've recovered, feel more optimistic, are definitely people who are coping better in the pandemic, and that means they're more trusting. We did see, as you point out, a decline in trust in government, a 10-point drop in 1 year, which we don't see a drop of that significance very often in our study. We've been studying trust in Canada for 7 years. However, people are tired. The pandemic has been putting governments in the spotlight. It hasn't been easy for premiers and prime ministers and officials to know what to do next. And sometimes they've had contradictory decisions. One province might have different policies than another. Canada and the US haven't always agreed. So people have just lost faith in government after 2 years.
And it's interesting that, as you said, this survey shows correlations between stress, anxiety, and trust. So tell us a little bit more about how stress and anxiety leads to mistrust in our leaders.
Well, we know that when people are feeling more optimistic and confident, they have higher trust. So, for example, it's often the case that when a region or a country is suffering economic hardships, we see trust scores go down because people don't feel the economy is working for them anymore. They don't feel that government policies are working for them. It's, in large part what led to the Brexit decision in the UK, where so many people felt that the European Common Market wasn't serving their economic needs, so they voted to leave, enough to bring the country out of the Union. So in our case, what we've seen in Canada in trust over the last several years is there's an east-west divide. Trust is lower in the West than it is in the East. And how that came about was in parallel with the fall of oil prices and the hardships in the energy sector in Alberta in particular, but also, as you know, in Saskatchewan. So trust scores right now are lowest of anywhere in Alberta, and they're low for every aspect of what we survey in Alberta, whether it's trust in corporate chief executive officers, trust in government, trust in the prime minister, trust in their own premier. Albertans are just in a bad shape in terms of their trust levels right now, and it's mainly driven by the economic issues in that province. I'm not saying it's the only part of it, but it is a big driver because it started 3 years ago.
It's really troubling information, especially for Alberta, sir. Did you see any difference between age groups as well in this survey?
Well, yes, in general, in the study of trust around the world, we know that trust usually grows with age and experience. So in any given trust survey you might do in any country, you would always expect to see higher trust levels with older population segments compared to younger. In Canada, that's true as well. So our, Gen Z, for example, or millennials have a lower trust level in almost all cases compared to baby boomers or older Canadians. Where it differs is in some specific areas where the younger people are perhaps more interested in the services or a newer technology. So we find, for example, that younger people in Canada have higher trust scores for social media channels as a reliable way to get information, in contrast to lower scores for older Canadians. We also know that younger people are more likely to trust new types of services that maybe they have grown up using or adopted more quickly. I'm thinking now, for example, of streaming services like Netflix, where younger people are cutting their cables, using Netflix instead for their entertainment. We see a higher trust score with streaming services with young people compared to older people. And another example would be cannabis producers. Again, higher trust scores with younger people, but lower with older people. It depends in part on the sector and the industry.
All right, Mr. McLellan, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
It was my pleasure to talk about the CanTrust Index. Thank you.
We'll be right back, everyone. British Columbia's provincial health officer says the COVID-19 pandemic and the toxic drug crisis are intertwined. Dr. Bonnie Henry made the comment yesterday after the BC Coroner Service released figures showing 2021 was the deadliest year on record for suspected overdoses, with more than 2,200 recorded. Dr. Henry says getting through the next phase of the pandemic is vital to helping people caught in the opioid crisis. Well, joining us now to give us a deeper look into BC's opioid crisis is Dr. Ramneek Dosanjh, president of Doctors of BC. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for having me on your show today.
So how has the opioid crisis evolved and intertwined with the pandemic, as Dr. Henry is saying?
We've known since 2016 that BC declared a public health emergency in response to this ongoing crisis of illicit drugs-related toxicity and the overdose deaths. The numbers, as you know, have only worsened during the pandemic, and this is a crisis of epic proportions. While deaths have happened across the socioeconomic spectrum, there's been a disproportionate impact on young males.
And do you think the attention on the pandemic may have overshadowed the opioid crisis in BC?
I do believe it's been a tricky situation to navigate. As you can attest, the media coverage has been pandemic and COVID focused around the globe as of late. I do feel that for us on the ground, these simultaneous crises have affected our work life the same in a way, and only exacerbated the way that we're able to respond and provide for this magnitude of crisis.
So what are BC doctors and yourself recommending in order to tackle this growing epidemic, doctor?
We know that the burden of the COVID pandemic has put immense pressure on an already constrained system. We've had increasing inequities, intermittent resources, burnout on the front line, as well as a deep sense of loss of connection and belonging. And we know that addiction is a multifaceted approach. We need to work on prevention, harm reduction, and urgent intervention.
It's really interesting that you mention the burnout among doctors and healthcare workers. We've been seeing this across the country. So tell us a little bit more about how this has impacted services for the opioid crisis in particular, doctor.
Well, if you think about how about the access to hospitals and urgent care and our frontline workers, staff, healthcare workers, our emergency first responders, everyone has been overwhelmed with the response through COVID. And the opioid crisis, the 911 calls, and the urgent nature of immediate availability has only been exacerbated by COVID plugging up the hospitalization rate and access to care.
And are there any other factors that may have led to 2021 being the deadliest year on record for opioid deaths, doctor?
I think this is absolutely correct. I believe that the access to healthcare and resources and all of the things that are concerning to the social determinants of health that impact all of our public safety and health have been constrained. And we have been under so much duress from the front lines to our government working very hard to try to correct this.
So what's at risk here, Dr. Dosanjh, if nothing is done to improve the opioid crisis here?
I think this is unacceptable. I feel that the way that we have gone, we need to act now. We need to get involved and try to implement strategies across our healthcare sector, involve as many people, including these patients and their families. It's devastating to watch this happen and not have an urgent crisis response. I believe that everyone has been trying their best in a collaborative effort, but we must act now.
Devastating to watch indeed, Doctor. About a minute left here, but what resources are currently available for BC residents that may be facing addiction right now?
So there's multiple avenues in which people can access care. And what I've alluded to are the harm reduction techniques. And we are having safe prescribing and safer supply networks that have been established and been effective in this crisis. We need to increase and bolster the infrastructure and support across the sector in terms of having people to have access to safe addiction care. Also, the understanding, we need to destigmatize how addiction is looked at in our public interface. We also need to provide more counseling support and more access to things that can improve the social determinants of health.
Dr. Dosanjh, thank you again for this inside look at BC's opioid crisis.
Thank you very much for having me today.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. See you later, Canada.